And I also happen very loosely to be affiliated with EPLIP, the Education Policy, Instructional Leadership, and Leadership and Practice or something. Anyway,
Yes.
doctoral program here. And we're very grateful that CMEI and EPLIP are co-sponsoring this event. So we welcome you. You're coming in from the policy world, or from the civic and moral education world, or just because you are excited about education policy in Israel, or hearing Yuta Tamir talk, which are all very good reasons to be here. I will say very briefly, because I always do this song and dance at the beginning on behalf of CMEI. We have an incredibly robust student and faculty presence here at the Ed School who are interested in issues of civic and moral education. If you are interested in those issues and you have not yet joined our listserv or our name, we invite you to do so. There is a form coming around that we ask you to sign, even if you are affiliated, so then we can prove to the dean and to others that we are attracting lots of interest. But more importantly than that, if you join our listserv and our name, then you will really receive lots of information about stuff that's going on, conferences you might wish to attend, talks, opportunities, etc. I will say that just looking ahead, in 2 weeks, on November 1st, Thursday, November 1st, we have Scott Sider, who will be speaking here on his new book, Character Compass, which is a study of 3 charter schools in the Boston area, and the 3 very different ways in which they conceive of the social and civic education that they're providing, and how that sort of plays out in instructional and in other ways. It's a really interesting book. Scott's a graduate from our doctoral program here from a few years ago, so we're excited to welcome him back. And we also have upcoming in January another film, part of our film series, and some more stuff, so we invite you to get involved. I'm really, really excited that we have Yael Tamir here to talk to us. She is an international exemplar of people who work, as we call it here at the Ed School, the nexus of theory, or research, policy, and practice. She is an incredibly distinguished political theorist. When I was a doctoral student at Oxford back in the early and mid-90s, I remember reading her book on liberal nationalism and having lots of debates about it. It was really shifting the field of how people thought about civic identity and nationalism at the time. It continues to resonate. It's one of these books that has a very, very, very long shelf life. And she has remained extraordinarily influential in the world of political theory, while also being Minister of Education in Israel for how many years was it? 3 years, making really important decisions about schools in Israel at the time, about state-run Jewish schools, about state-funded Arab Israeli schools, about schools for the ultra-Orthodox Jews who live in the state. Really important curricular decisions, policy decisions, other things. And now that Yuli has stepped back from that role, she and I were just talking, she's thinking about writing a book that tries in the best way possible to take her experiences as a Minister of Education and think about the kinds of dilemmas that she was facing in her work as a policymaker and how to make sense of them for moving forward, which is exactly the kind of work that I have modeled here, and that she will do an amazing job of modeling for us. So she's going to talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we're really honored to have Nicole Simon, who is a 4th-year doctoral student here at the Ed School, who has a lot of knowledge about issues of teacher quality and teacher practice and how schools actually work on the ground versus how they are supposed to work in theory. And she will provide 5 to 10 minutes worth of commentary that will help provoke our thinking. And then we will have, as always, a full group discussion. So it can be a Q&A, we can sort of fall into that, and that's fine. Or we can also really turn it into a more holistic discussion where we really grapple with the issues that Yuli and Nicole have put in our laps for us to deal with. And as always, we make these sessions fairly long. This is an hour-and-a-half session so as to have a real conversation afterward. But we also recognize that people
Okay, thanks. It's my pleasure to be here. What I'll try to do is to share with you some thoughts that I've spent through ERA. I am now reflecting back on my time in the ministry. I've actually been a minister for 2 years, but I've also been in the parliament for 10 years and was a member of the education department. So dealt with education closely for over a decade. And I'm trying to figure out what I've learned. So that's not a simple question to ask myself. So I'm looking back in retrospect, what have I learned? And probably realizing the interest of the group, I should have done something on civic education. So that's a topic I dealt a lot with, which is probably more of interest to the people here. But somehow this is something I'm obsessed with right now, so I can't take it off my mind. And maybe some other time I'll come and talk about civic education. The purpose of this talk is actually to reflect on the international tests. Now, how many of you know something about PISA and TIMSS? Okay. Because the average person on the street in the United States, so I'll speak a little bit about it, but the reason I was interested in it is that, unlike the United States, Israel is a small country and we have here a British representative. Non-American countries are very much parochial in their attitude towards education and are totally obsessed by the international test, which is not so much the case in the United States, though I think it is filtering in, and I'll show you where. So the reason I started thinking about it is that I went to this meeting of ministers of education of the OECD, and here comes this guy, Andreas Schleifer, who is a very prominent person in the PISA administration, and gives this talk that I'll show you briefs from it in a moment. And there is a complete agreement about what he says, and I feel like I'm the only idiot in the room who says, no, that can't be true. So I kept on saying to the PISA people, well, whenever they came to Israel is not doing very well on PISA, so they thought it was because we're not doing very well. I thought it because they're saying something that is wrong. And we had this debate going on for 2 years, but when you're a minister, you don't have time to look at facts. You just rush through the daily life and try to survive. So when I finished my term, the first thing I've done is start looking at the facts. And the facts were very interesting for me. And since then I'm obsessed with it because I think it's becoming worse, and because the promise that is embedded in the international test is not really working. So this presentation comprises of 3 things. First of all, I'm going to look at the message the international tests are sending and claim that it is misleading, especially in the developed world. I'll make this distinction between the developed and the non-developed world. I will claim that it is filtering, whether you know it or not, to the education system. In most of the countries, and I assume also in the United States, I'm starting to see papers reflecting that. And accepting this thesis, the reason it bothers me is that it puts an enormous burden on educators that I think they cannot possibly meet, and therefore it's bound to be another failure of education. And one of the things that worried me in general is that many tasks are now placed on the shoulders of educators in education, tasks that they cannot possibly meet. And therefore, when they don't meet them, as you would accept they wouldn't, they are blamed as not being effective, as public education is deteriorating, and so on. So part of the reason education is in crisis is that the goals that they set for public education, I think, are totally unreal. And if you set unreal goals, you're in for a disappointment. So here is the global promise. And I'm emphasizing that it is a global promise. In a moment, you'll understand why. It is termed in very precise terms. It says 1 standard deviation difference on test performance is related to 1% difference in annual growth rate of GDP per capita. Now, all of you who know a little bit of economics, or just read the Financial Times from time to time, or the New York Times, know that the West is very much worried about lack of fast growth. And since the crisis in 2008, you know, everybody is sort of at best surviving, but not really growing, and this is a worrisome issue for everyone. By the way, if there are questions, if you don't understand something, just feel free to ask, because I'll go fairly quickly through the presentation, so we'll have time for discussion. Okay, so here comes this guy from Stanford, his name is Hanasher, and he draws this beautiful graph that the moment I saw it, I didn't like it. And what it actually shows is the effect of three kinds of reforms. The green one implemented in 30 years, the blue one implemented in 20 years, and the first one implemented in 10 years, and how much they add to the GDP. Now, the reason I didn't like it is that I don't know anything in life or in education that goes as smoothly as this. So this was my initial response when I saw it. I said, no, that's not life. Maybe it's a theory, but let's see how it correlates with real life, because real life never looked like this. However, the work of Hanasher is echoed very strongly in the international test. By the way, it's an interesting, I don't know, I don't have the time or the money to do it, but somebody should get to check. I think there is a cross-sponsoring of all these things. One sponsors the other. And therefore, it's a very close team of people working together with a very close agenda that is not going to change. So Andreas Schleicher, who was the analyst of the PISA exam, tells you the following. The annual gain of 25 PISA points, you see how we moved from an improvement in the test to real points in PISA, will give you basically the same results over the years. Okay, so here was my temptation. Let's look at what really happens in real life in order to understand whether this works. Now, before I'm looking at real life, I just have to say something that I didn't choose to use the growth per capita. It's something that I've taken from these graphs. But growth per capita is a very sensitive issue, because if you look at a very developing country, like say Ghana, which we'll see in a moment, with a per capita, which is called PPE, which is purchasing power of the dollar of 1,800, or Finland with 38,000, then 1% means something very different. So the percentage of growth is actually misleading in itself, and I wouldn't have chosen it as a way to look at things, but I'm responding here to a choice made by others, so I just wanted you to be aware of it. So let's look at this chart. This is a chart that looks at, these are the test results, okay? And the test results, as you can see, are taken from 1990 and 2000, and the GDP growth is taken 20 years or 10 years later, because everybody will tell you that there is a gap between the time people are attending school and entering the market, okay? So it's important to look at the gap. And what happens, you see, this is a very mixed table. The first 12 countries are performing economically in very different ways. The yellow, the European developing countries, are growing, I think there is 196 countries in the world now registered. So you see some of them are moving faster, some of them are moving slower. But all of them are in the second part of over 100. So they're slowly growing in the last few years. Obviously China and Singapore are growing very fast. And Korea and Japan, each country has a different story. The interesting thing is that there is no one pattern that you can identify. The most interesting example is Ireland. Look at Ireland. Ireland actually invested a lot in improving its test scores and moved from the 26th place to the 11th place, which is an enormously impressive result. But it's the only country that its economy is actually in regression, right? Minus something, and now it's about 0. Look at other countries that have been improving very much. much from 19 to 8, from 20 to 12. They're not growing that fast. They're growing rather slowly. Now, who's growing fast? When you look at some of the reports of the countries that are growing really fast, you see the Philippines, Peru, Malaysia, Egypt, and Pakistan. None of them are on the list, except for Malaysia. None of these countries is actually participating in the exams. They probably have a very low level of education, but they're growing very fast. Whereas, according to the HBSC report, that actually also is very pretentious, and look at the economy of the world in the next 50 years, which is good when investors don't know what to do next week, but they have this report. They say that Finland, Sweden, and Norway, right, the really favorite stars of the exams, are going to grow very slowly and fall out of the list of the 30th strongest economies. So we see a shift of power. It's also, if you look at Economic Watch, it will say the same thing. The world that is growing fast is not the world that is performing well in the exams, except, by the way, for China. Ghana is an interesting case, and you will see in a moment why it is an interesting case. Ghana is actually basically a state where illiteracy, as you can see, I don't want to read all the details, illiteracy is very high. But it's growing very fast. And when I looked at Ghana, it was the first time that I did the following thing. I looked at the map of illiteracy in the world. So the countries, the blue, the sort of the dark navy blue countries are the most educated countries, and then it gets worse and worse. The more colorful it is, the worse it is, basically. Okay, so keep this map in mind and look at this, which is not a great map, but it's the only one I could find. It just doesn't come across very well. But the countries that are going to grow slowly are actually the countries where literacy is very high. Now, this is not a surprise. It says only one thing. There is no global pattern of growth, and therefore there is no global pattern of influence of test results. And this attempt to create a global recommendation that fits the developed and the more developed and the less developed world is wrong. So what should we think about? And maybe this is something that I'll put back when we'll talk about, we'll have the discussion. The developing world should ask itself a clear question about the influence and the balance between skills, education, and cheap labor. And that's, I think, those of you who look a little bit on the economy of developing countries know that it's not only about skills, it's also about the cost of labor and the cost of transportation, why jobs are moving to the developed world. Sorry, to the developing world. The developed world should think about other things. What is the influence of education on growth in the developed world? And now I make this separation between the developed world and the developing world. And in the developed world, I think we should separate between the Asian countries that are, I think, by now considered developed or fastly developing, and European countries. I think we should ask a question that is very important and is not often asked, is are we reaching an educational plateau? Namely that the improvement in education does not produce anymore the kind of growth we assumed it will. And are we losing out on the global option? If we have time, I'll talk about it. It's an excellent book. It's called The Global Option that just came out. And those of you who are interested in the connection between education and the job market, I think should read it. It's really, really great. So, there are actually research that shows, which I'll show you too, that the relationship between education and growth in the developed world is very weak. Whereas in the developing world, it's strong, but less stronger than people anticipate. Okay, so if you look at how education influences the economy, it's different, and it's not very important in the developed world. Again, if you look at the HSBC report, which is really an excellent report, they used the work of the Harvard professor Robert Barrow. I don't know how many of you know his work. He's done work on education and development. But after they looked at his work, they decided that his work overestimates the influence of education and decided to reduce the influence of education on their charts. And the way they did it, they looked back. They said, okay, assuming that he is right, assuming that he is right, Germany, for example, should have grown much faster. India should have grown much slower. So they looked back, a decade back, and made a calibration of the model. And what they decided to do is to lower the impact of education and got what I claim to be very accurate model. Now, this is an interesting point because education more and more is supported as a means of economic growth. I don't like it. I think it should be supported as means for personal, individual growth. But when you look at the language now, people talk about education. Education is about income, jobs, growth. It's a commodity. Now, because it's so strong, I think we have a duty to ask, is it working? By the way, a lot of people don't like the question, and I've been in several conferences, people say, oh, don't ask it, because if we know the truth, maybe nobody will fund education. But that shows you how deep this conception went even into the minds of educators who are really afraid to raise the issue, because if, God forbid, somebody will know the truth, they might not be supported. But in a moment, I'll tell you why I think it is important to look at it. This is just something that is interesting for people who do correlations. I have a theory that why the charts are so clear, because there was a really short period. Remember, these tests were going on from mid-80s to the 2000s, that really Europe grew in a way that was very linear. And what we see is the linear growth of Europe, then more countries join in, and more countries join in, and the economic crisis came in. So that's less important. Now, if you ask yourself if it influences the United States, then this guy, who, I don't know, I'm a foreigner, I shouldn't say anything, he assumes, together with Arlie Duncan, and I think in this respect, does not really make a large enough change in education, in the conceptual framework of education, that the developed world needs to improve test scores, improving global competitiveness and enhancing growth. And there is a sentence he keeps on using: if we don't out-educate them, they will out-compete us. Namely, think now about the reverse of this sentence. If we out-educate them, they will not out-compete us. So this part of this sentence is probably true, but the reverse is not true. Okay? The reverse of the sentence, if we out-educate them. Let's say the United States now would have had the most brilliant education system in the world. All the children will get the best result in PISA and TIMSS. Still, the structural problems of the American economy will remain, and the rest of the world, and maybe rightly so, is going to compete America in many, many spheres of knowledge. So, what can you learn from PISA and TIMSS? Just before so this is the first part of my presentation. I think I did it very quickly. And this is a short one. I think we should think independently now about growth pattern and education in the West. I think we as educators who care about education should start thinking about why education is important, not only in economic terms, because I think we are coming to an economic turmoil. And even here in the United States, people are starting to doubt the value of the education. Do they get a fair return from education? Does good education ensures income? What are the next jobs to be developed in the market? Do they really demand the kind of qualities that are presented by PISA? I mean, a lot of people think that the market is going to develop to service-oriented professions. So do they mean that they need mathematics and science, or do they mean that they need to learn care, empathy, and how to give services? So it's a whole range of questions that you have to start asking when you free your mindset from this PISA thing, and that's what we should do. It's more complicated, much more responsibility for policymakers because they have to think for themselves, much less comparable because different countries would probably have different answers. But before it comes to us, I mean, before people would start saying education is not working, I think, or they already said that, I think we should reflect on it. The second aspect of emphasizing the PISA and TIMSS exams as the heart of what we should be doing is the following. When you look at what explains variation between results in PISA and in TIMSS, internally, it could be between schools, states, neighborhoods, whatever, you find an interesting phenomenon. 68%, some researchers claim 70, doesn't really matter, like in the 70s, is explained by out-of-the-system variables. Here is the number of books at home, which is actually parents' education and income, immigration, culture, urban areas. So almost 70% of the variables are out-of-the-system variables. The influence of the inner system variables, like class size, teacher development, or pay for performance, are really small. Now, you would think that this is a conclusion that would send people out to understand the natures of poverty, race consciousness, inner cities working, and so on. But here is what the researchers say in the next page, that although the large majority of the variation is explained by out-of-the-system factors, these factors are largely fixed. So education policy must primarily focus on making changes in education factors. What it means actually, that when people look at education now, they do this separation between education policy and the rest of the world. So education policy has to repair these damages that happen in our society by looking only at the inner system variables that are actually going to influence really a small part of the ability of children to meet the qualification for PISA and for TIMSS. Why is it so? Partly it's departmentalization of the research, partly it's because the PISA and TIMSS people come from education, and since they are all international NGOs, they don't really like to mess up with the social policies and tell countries, oh, you have to close your gaps, you have to give more nutrition to children, poverty is the biggest problem in your country rather than a score test, inequality is a bad thing. They are not for that purpose, right? They're not these kind of advisors. They are advising on education. So they take a problem that is 70% influenced by external variables and put it all on the shoulders of education and try to amend it by amending education. And this creates two phenomena that are worrying for me. First of all, I think it actually becomes, the PISA policy now is a conservative policy. Because it says if you just amend education, everything will be okay. But that's not true. And the McKinsey, I don't know how many of you are aware of the McKinsey report, it says an education system is as good as its teachers are. No, an education system is as good as its social environment is. But, they were hired to write a report on education. The truth of the matter is the poor teachers are supposed to somehow overcome the difficulties of the society, which they're not going to overcome. So then people say, well, it's the quality of the teachers, it's the quality So all these reports, I don't think I don't know, I have no clue what their state of mind is, but I do know that the consequences, they become conservative. And actually, when I look at the people who pick up these reports, at least in Israel, but I think elsewhere, it's a lot of businessmen, it's a lot of people who just want a better education system in order to have a better economy, and they don't really want to have a redistribution of resources, or closing social and economic gaps, or creating equal opportunities. Actually, in this work I'm doing, one of the issues that I'm dealing with is actually how societies create gap preservation policies, and I think they're creating it because they are not really interested in equality, they just want better education results, and nobody tells them that's not going to work. So, that goes to the question, if PISA and TIMSS show such a strong class difference, how best practices are always about school autonomy, teacher training, and so on, and never about social equality, fight with poverty, malnutrition, and so on. And it's important, not because the report is that important, because this is how social discourse is structured. They structure the discourse, and people go along with them, and therefore, I think, moving more, if they like it or not, into the conservative direction. So, just to conclude, why do I think PISA and TIMSS are missing the target? And they have many other virtues. I think there are good exams, are always trying to improve. They do promote now much more thinking in their in the way they structure the exams. They have many virtues. I think it's a very professional group of people. However, there is no global recipe for growth. They should give it up, and they should be honest about it. Honesty is one thing we want to teach in schools. They should overestimate the value of education, because that puts unbearable pressure on education. Their best practices should be more socially driven rather than just educationally driven. The assumption to decontextualize education from social and cultural features of a society, I think, is vastly misleading. And again, I think that there are going to be many problems in our society, and I don't want education to be blamed for it. So, basically, I think this is an invitation to think about the correlation between, not to be afraid to think about the correlation between economy and education, even if the news are not that great. I think in the near future, a lot of young people will have to ask themselves, will they go to a good university even if they want a profitable job out of it? And good universities will have to ask themselves, how much do they charge if you can't really be sure to get a good job out of this? So I think that lots of things are going to change, and that's an invitation sort of to reflect about it. Thank you.
So thanks, Yuli, for speaking. Throughout your career, you've had a reputation as somebody who never shies away from tough conversations and really long battles, both in education and beyond. And in your service as a Minister of Education, you were enormously courageous in standing up for what you believed was right. As you said, even when you knew that it might cost you your post. So I really admire that. You raised a topic that is hot around the world now. The debate on the role that standardized tests plays and should play in assessing students and judging the quality of teachers in schools is raging here in the States. we now readily define the phrase student achievement with test scores. As Race to the Top of federal policy encourages states, including Massachusetts, to adopt policies for evaluating teachers that are based, at least in part, on student achievement scores, the questions that you ask surface repeatedly. And though periodically voices of resistance emerge, as in the case of the Chicago Teachers Union strike recently, and on a smaller scale, in yesterday's New York Times, there was a piece about parents who are keeping their children home from Brooklyn Public Schools on test days. These voices are largely muffled by policymakers at the top who buy into the rhetoric of the OECD, the World Bank, and other international testing agencies. Those who forget, as you say, that improved test scores do not imply systemic change and often simply reflect how effectively a specific group of kids has been prepared for a specific test. It's especially heartening, therefore, to hear somebody of your stature, a former Minister of Education, voice deep concern about the direction that we have already headed here in the States and around the world. I hope that you might talk a little bit about who some of your allies are in this fight and how we, from our position of power here at Harvard, might join this conversation in a louder way. So you make a number of important points about the way that policymakers look to education as the panacea, a heal-all strategies for economic woes. And what you demonstrate to be a very complex relationship between education and economic growth is widely and increasingly regarded as a very simple one. Policymakers have sold themselves and the rest of us the belief that there is a direct causal relationship between test scores and economic growth, often with disregard to other factors like poverty or war. And on the whole, educators and the public are buying this deterministic notion. I think that your talk is of really wide interest because, as I've said, your comments on the testing frenzy here and abroad hit home for just about everybody in the world thinking about education today. And though many of the problems that you discuss are universal, I think that you've raised a couple of issues that are unique to Israel. And I don't want us to gloss over the importance of those issues since we're here in the States and think most of us like Americans. So it would be illuminating to hear you talk in some more specifics about how the international testing affects a small non-English speaking country like Israel in ways that are perhaps very, very different from the way that they affect this country and others that are represented in this room. So if you could maybe respond by giving a little bit of context about Israel, who the education system there serves, Israel's status as a country that's both developed but also developing economically, and maybe even give a little bit more about the role of socialism in the history of Israel, which might allow you to touch on some of the civic education that you were itching to discuss. And then maybe you could talk in more specific terms about what you mean by the social, cultural, and political variables that mediate the causal relationship between test growth and test results and growth that you've written about. What do you mean when you say that universalized skills get prioritized over local, cultural, traditional, and social know-how and expertise? How has that played out in Israel? I'd also be really interested in hearing you talk about how international benchmarking helps an education minister think about a plan for improvement. In September, Haaretz, a major newspaper in Israel, reported that in comparison to other OECD countries, Israel ranks poorly on teacher salaries, class size, and spending. The gap between Israel's best and worst schools, as measured by PISA tests, is the widest among all developed nations. And how do these international comparisons help you dispel the myths that within Israel that the education system is fabulous, which, as you've written, is a myth grounded in results from one test in the 1960s that excluded immigrants and Arab students. So also, if you were an education minister today, how would you think through those sorts of results that have just surfaced? So thanks again for coming here and talking. Yeah.
I don't remember.
So,
Okay. Just as well. Okay. Well,
Here, we go back your mic so that.
while we're passing mics. Well, Israel is the Israeli education system is very, very complex. I would say that it's as complex as it is small. So it's very hard to talk about the Israeli education system in one breath. It's sort of a very complicated system. I'm not going to go into details too much. But I would just say that it is true, and I think that this is some of the problems and maybe some of the virtues of Israel. It's a very young society. I mean, in many characteristics, Israel is much more like the developing world than the developed. 30% of the citizens are under 18. Numbers are growing very fast. That's actually part of the reason that the classes are extremely crowded. And no matter how fast, there are regions in Israel that no matter how fast you build schools, the next few months you'll need another one. Which is not, by the way, the case, for example, in Finland or in other European countries. And though I initiated a school reform that raised teacher salaries, and it is up a little bit, and it should go up again, taking into account the enormous number of teachers you need, where so much young children going into school means that this is a very substantial governmental expense, the second after security in Israel. And it's, there are certainly limits of what Israel can do in education, and I think a lot has been done in the last few years. I've given my share, the new minister gave his share. So things are happening, but the birth rate is still sort of picking up, and a lot of the money is going into that. And when you're just sustaining the system as it was, you bring more money in, and still, you know, the per capita investment is still low. But also the cultural differences and the linguistic diversity in Israel makes it very difficult to think of it as one system, because there are actually 4 or 5 parallel systems that are very different in their performances. The good systems are rather good, not excellent, but good. And some of the weak ones are very, very weak. And unfortunately, like everywhere else in the world, it has to do with socioeconomic conditions. So if you go to the really, really poor Bedouin towns in the south, where it's a third world economy, families with 40 children living in a tent, their education improves, but very slowly. If you go to northern Tel Aviv, that looks like Brooklyn, it's very high. And that's the pattern. So one of the things that I've learned, and actually was very keen to do, was to make it very clear that you can't, I mean, just changing education, that's part of the reason I'm so firm about this message. Israel cannot reform its education system without starting to reform or close the social gaps. It's not going to work. The burden on teachers, anyhow, in Israel, unlike other places, is enormous. There are lots of children coming from conflict areas. There are always children that are new immigrants in school, a fair amount of them, with parents who do not speak the language. Hebrew is not a common language, so you have to teach Hebrew and English and Arabic. So there are many, many burdens on the system anyhow, and you can't just deal with the system without dealing with the environment. It's bound to be a disappointment. On the other hand, I just saw today the result of the proficiency tests. So in the school reform was K to middle school. It started in middle school only last year. We see in primary schools a constant small improvement, which I would expect is really the right kind of improvement. And in my term, I was very adamant about not expecting test results. That I was basically crucified for that. It was very difficult to pass a school reform that cost over 7 billion shekels without promising anything. I stood there in the government and they said, so, when are we going to be number 5 in the world? I said, I don't know. I don't have an idea. I can tell you what will happen in schools, and I can tell you how it will affect learning, and I can tell you how this will filter into results in the next 15 years, but I don't know. And even then, I will never give you numbers. Still, I have a professional dignity. I can't give you numbers. And they were all very pissed off by that. But I thought it was a message to the system. And every time I wrote the 10 most urgent thing the ministry should do, achievement was the last. I made sure achievement was the last one, just in order to make a message that I don't think that's the real thing. It's almost a lost case. You say, who are my allies? No one. Actually, no. My ally was the Prime Minister, I should say, which is an important ally in this issue. Because he was convinced that to give the money for the school reform without getting numbers. And I think because, you know, we had a partnership and he was respectful of my professional abilities. When I say to him, I can't measure it and I don't want to just be registered as an idiot, so I'm not going to say anything, he came in the government and said, let's do it. But he was also very, 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 very unhappy about me not worrying about test scores. And in my time, Israel didn't, before my time, because the test scores were very low, Israel prepared for PISA, which is not allowed to do. The test score went higher. I stopped the preparation, they went down. People were very angry. And now the PISA tests are coming out, and Israel, I should say, regretfully just manipulated them across the board. And now I'm sort of convinced that it is happening in other places, and most people are just not courageous enough to come out and say that people prepare for the test, they allocate the schools. Actually, this year in Israel, children who weren't expected to do well on the test were taken out of the class when the test was given. So that seems to me disrespectful of the notion of the test, and disrespectful of the poor children who are actually you guys. I'm not going to be in a national average because you are not good enough. I would love to have people around the world speaking out, telling me whether it happens elsewhere. Without having any data. Yeah.
There's a story in today's New York Times about the school superintendent in Texas, right? Who's actually being prosecuted for that kind of manipulation, taking the students out and, removing the ones that are not learning well on tests.
Yeah, I don't know how many of you know, but no, Berliner's work on high-stake testing. I think everyone should read it who is interested in the morality of testing. And it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable. It's just people. The pressure is so high from the minister down that people just cannot withstand it, and they're just. What we get is just, and it's not only that you don't really get the adequate picture of what is happening, is that you teach children that that's what, everything is allowed to be done in order to fake the results. So that's even worse than that you don't get an adequate picture of the knowledge of the system. So it's very tough, very, very tough. Fight for people to be standing out and saying enough is enough. Let's stand against it. And if there are partners here, I'm seeking partners everywhere for that, because I really think it's going to determine the way people see the role of educators and the role of education. And when there is corruption in schools, and there is, Berliner and what's her name, Sharon. It's a book by Nicholas, I think, Sharon Nicholas in David Berliner. It also reflects back on the respect to teacher, because once again, the poor teachers are placed in this position, and then everybody says, that's the leadership you get from teachers, right? Cheating. So wherever you go, you're causing this dilemma, and I think it's very dreadful. The way it influences education in Israel and elsewhere, for example, these things that are out of the test, for example, democratic skills, nobody cares about them. Israel ranks now constantly very low on democratic skills, with very bad things happening to civic and democratic education in Israel. And that's an interesting story in itself. But it's not in the test, who knows? You can't compare it, sort of. So, that's again, or suddenly local culture is out. Who knows what you learn in poetry, or in art, or in Yiddish literature. No one cares, because it's not comparable. So, since I'm basically a communitarian, and I believe very firmly in the importance of cultures and local tradition, and I don't want the whole world to be universalized, I do believe that this is a tragedy that many countries, and the smaller you are, the more incentive you have to ignore your own identity, just in order to be part of the test. So it's true that the tests, by the way, are done in local languages, so that I think was a major thing, because if everything would have been done in English, obviously it would have been biased towards the Anglo-speaking world. But still, you do the test in your language, but then all the other things that are linguistically enriching your language are less important, because your language skill is not only about reading and writing, it's the poetry you know, and the history you know, and the Bible you read, and the geography you study. So the linguistic skills are not only literacy, are much more than that, and that is getting lost in the wave of education. So basically, I think there are many reasons to be looking at education in a much more richer and larger framework than the tests, both in Israel and abroad. And I just have an intuition it's going to change. I mean, those of you who want to fight, that's the time to fight. Because I have an intuition, we're near a turning point. Partly because of the economic crisis, and partly because of people are just being fed up. People understand that this, enormous amount of testing is just, ruining children's will to go to school. And my neighbor's daughter told me this year she decided to stay home, not to go to school. She's in 3rd grade. I said, why aren't you going to school anymore? You used to like it. She said, no, we have this proficiency test these years, and I'm going to fail. Why are you going to fail? You're a good student. She said, no, the teacher said it's very difficult, that everyone should concentrate, because a lot of children fail. And I thought, the poor girl is going to a 3rd class, and she's so intimidated, she's going to fail, because she comes now to school intimidated by the thought that this is very difficult. She was like, teachers children imitate their teacher. You immediately know that that's exactly what the teacher said, because she says it in the teacher's voice. It's very difficult. I mean, lots of children fail. So that's not a great future for our children. Yeah.
So one of the determinants you say education is only partly responsible for economic growth, and you said that there's so many other factors like cheap labor, etc., right? So looking at that model, that's very much based on like the economy as it is now, but where it's industrialization, cheap labor, and the factory model, and that's still prevalent. But they say now the nature of the economy is changing. It's moving more towards an information-based economy, like you said, service providing and all of that. My question is, and that's where the whole buzzword 21st century skills come from, right? They're talking about high order, problem solving, critical thinking, that kind of thing. And that's what the drive of the piece says, right? That it's not measuring, like it's measuring 21st century skills. And they're saying this is what the nature of the economy will be in the future. So I understand why those skills are not relevant now, but the economy is headed that way. So would you still not see a correlation between education and providing students with these skills and that translating into economic growth?
Well, first of all, I can only look at the past, right? So, the PISA tests of 20 years ago were supposed to be predicting 20 years ahead, and they didn't. I don't know, as I said, they're changing and improving, and they could be getting closer to better ways of evaluation. But generally, I find it hard to see how testing as a major educational power can really support creative thinking and can really do what they would like to do. Because I think this is where the means defy the purpose. I think one of the problems is that what happens? Okay, PISA changes the structure of the question. Right now they're changing again. Immediately, what people do, they distribute the structure of this question to schools. And everything is concentrated on that. It's a very limiting type of learning. And by the nature of the test, it can't cover everything. And anyhow, lots of children are getting too tired and leave it in the middle. That's one of the problems, because it's a very long and tiring test. But that's the moment you get a test question, and then immediately it's distributed to the system. Even if it's very sophisticated, everybody is now copying it, and everybody is doing the same. Rather, even for the teacher to create inventive, reflective questions. Nobody dares move from these four. It can change 2 years later, it will be another. That's not the kind of way to develop, I think, 21st century skills. And then, you know, it's true, Andreas Schleifer says that 21st century skills is living together, civic responsibility. Doesn't come out in the test at all. So testing in itself is a means that changes the educational process. And I would say, right, I wouldn't mind getting from PISA, and I think it would be very helpful as a Minister of Education or as an educator, a list of what they think are the best skills and examples the teachers can use, and ideas about how to train teachers. All this would be great, because they're really professionals. But once it's reduced to this channel, into this task channel, it loses its ability to be really liberating for teachers, because they get this new kind of thinking that they can use. It becomes frightening for teachers. And that's the moment it becomes ineffective, I think.
I may be asking the same question, but in a slightly different way. I love where the talk ends, and I find your diagnosis refreshing, but I'm struggling to make sense of what seems like a very contradictory, progressive and conservative impulse of the talk, which contradictions are great, so I'm not sure you have to flesh them out, but with a lowercase c and a lowercase p. And the two examples I would give would be, one is this impulse that we want to think about closing gaps, right? You mentioned immigrant communities, and then on the other hand, you're saying that economies should be open to embracing service jobs, which, if anyone looks at it, the influx of service jobs are one of the greatest aggravators to relative inequalities within societies. And who's going to get funneled into those service jobs but immigrants who have low education and low social capital? But then it also seems to play out on the international stage when you say developing countries, just be aware that some of the most dynamic economies in the developing world are selling cheap labor, often child labor, and environmental degradation as a way to get ahead or as their competitive advantage, which again seems like a recipe for progress through conservatism, which is keeping the status quo in the international arena. So I'm trying to make sense of these two, and maybe it's because we're looking back and trying to look forward.
No, it's an excellent question.
And I don't doubt that you're looking forward. I'm just trying to understand how do we break that line.
It's an excellent question, and I think especially the first part. The second part is something that I don't know what to do, how we can control it. Whether it's cheap labor, people use it, okay? This is the role of the market, and it's stronger than all of us. And I think there are fights to raise, to prevent child slavery.
But what about, just as an example, Singapore, where they said we're actually not going to develop the traditional way, we're going to leapfrog Western economies. And they actually are a finance capital now, and they basically didn't go through the stages that we're used to of selling cheap labor.
Yeah, but
So I'm just curious whether, if you were a minister, why couldn't you say we're going to leapfrog the Western countries?
we will.
We're going to leapfrog them. So we're not going to sell our cheap labor, we're going to out-educate them. In one generation, we're going to have more engineers than
So
anybody.
Singapore, I think, is a very unique case because it's a small dictatorial society.
And it's an island.
And, a lot of democratic limitations don't apply there. The minister, with a charming person, I met him, decides what he ever wants to do, and they just do it. And it works differently in non-democratic society. Okay? And also, it's a very small society, so selling cheap labor is not something that is good for their market. Okay? Because there are very few people, and they want everyone to be very professional, which is not true in India or in China. or in Bangladesh or wherever. Now, the real, I think, interesting question that you're asking, and I think this is the question of the future, you're not wrong to identify, is that assuming that the number of well-earning jobs in the West is going to reduce. That's my assumption. Why? Because there are enough intelligent and now better educated people in China, in India, and soon there will be in Africa to compete the West. It's also a number game. You can't assume that, I don't know, a billion Chinese will not produce as many engineers as America. And all these charts about, who produces more engineers and doctors, even if, and I'm not sure that's the case, an American engineer would be 10 times better trained than a Chinese one, at some point they will catch up. And Chinese universities are getting better and they invest in higher education. And unlike what a lot of capitalists thought beforehand, they would just supply the labor and we will supply the know-how. They want to have their own know-how. And they will catch up just because that's, I think that's the way progress works, and that's the way these societies are now developing, and they have a middle class that wants to study, and they develop new institutions, and they will catch up. Then, the West will have to ask itself how to divide labor. And that's your question. And I don't buy the assumption, your assumption, that at the end of the day services will be only for poor refugees and immigrants. I think people will have to decide if they want to work, whether they want to do services. And there will be another question that goes with it. Do you want to be overeducated for your job, just for your soul and your human capital and your self-development, knowing that being better educated is not going to give you the income? And I know it's very foreign to the way people think right now. They think, oh, the service jobs will bring foreign workers to do them. I think it's starting to change in Europe. People start to think about service job as something they're ready to do because, 25% of young Spanish or young Greeks are unemployed. At some point somebody say, hey, there were these jobs and somebody should take it because it's better than
Just a small friendly amendment, because I like where you're headed, but two things. One is you're zooming in again on the individual, and you're saying more people will make the choice to go into these service jobs because they'll say there's no point, and that individual gratification is not in and of itself enough to justify 4 years in debt. But again, that's locating within the individual and the externalities of what happens to a society. And you were talking earlier about democratic development and whether society and collective good isn't optimized or communitarian isn't optimized by people having advanced degrees and or more education rather than just enough to clean someone's nails or dole out a coffee at Starbucks or wipe the tushy of someone who's 85 and infirm. I mean, I don't think we should sort of sugarcoat what these jobs are, but the second way in which I think you have to get more systems-oriented is it's not about the individual making that choice. It's what society says about parent work and how it's valued or not. So they may come to that algorithm, but unless society says that's going to give a livable wage, then them coming to it is, again, aggravating inequality, not somehow...
I agree with you. I think it goes from professionalizing lots of professions, and on the other hand, making education not only something, it's very interesting that economists now start to speak about happiness and about living a satisfying life. And more people understand that living a satisfying life is not only income. Now, if you get rid or put aside for a moment the income side of it, I think the questions you will ask about what kind of education and lifelong learning and so on. So it's not that I can draft now a map of the future, but I think that we're going into a different direction, and we should, as I said, it's an invitation to think about those things rather than in the same pattern, more higher. When Barack Obama says I think he said, I hope I cite him rightly, that the best cure for poverty is higher education for every child. I'm saying no, because there will be lots of highly educated poor people in the future. The educated poor are going to be a great section of our society, and you have to think about it. So you want to raise their salaries, you want to reduce their education, you want to create new jobs. It's not that I have a recipe, but that's where we're heading, so we should better think about it. don't think I'm advocating not to stop, doing things, but to put things in a larger framework. My decision about the school reform was actually very much influenced by the way I thought about these things. And I did a school reform, and after many, many years, raised teachers' salaries in Israel in about 30 to 40%, which is quite not enough. Nothing is enough, but quite considerable given what we could afford. When I was asked what I thought was the most important thing in schools and where I think improvement can really make a difference now, the pressure was on small classes, and I thought small classes are not the solution, partly because they're very expensive, and B, I wasn't sure they are effective. So I wanted exactly as you said, I wanted something that will start working now with a given sum of money that they have, several billions of shekels. It was like 7 billion shekels, which is a lot of money, but not enough, obviously, because education always demands more. And what I decided to do is that the heart of the reform would be changing teaching in schools by doing three things. Asking teachers to stay in school for the whole day, changing the way they work in peer evaluation and together, because in Israel beforehand a teacher would come just for the teaching hours and leave. So teachers are in school, there are more adults in school for the whole day. Teachers were asked to work with small groups. We introduced small groups teaching in a very large, substantial amount of small group teaching. Every teacher is now 20% of the time works with a group of 1 to 5 children in order to allow more deliberative, reflective way of thinking, better evaluation of students, not through testing, but through dialogue, different kinds, a whole pedagogy is developed around it. And certainly we changed the teachers' salaries so that they will include raised for professional training. Okay, so while the teacher union agreed to all this, we raised their salaries during the reform. And there were all things that I thought would give fruit, not immediately, but in a reasonable time, and they would create more tools for improvement. Because I think, and this is one of the things that bothers me a lot, that everybody wants improvement. Actually, what is lacking is a theory of improvement and a way to tell students and teachers how to work together to improve their knowledge. So that you have to give them tools to improve what happens in schools. And time is the most expensive thing that the ministry distributes, right? Teaching hours. So what we did is really gave small classes. We also gave schools in the periphery the ability to divide classes in the first 3 grades to half a class when they were learning basic skills. So it was all oriented really towards learning processes. Rather than the minister that came after me continue a similar reform in the high school, but put most of the money in preparation for the tests, which is, short-term versus long-term, pedagogical versus more sort of instrumental, one-hitting. And in many ways, I'm very glad I did it. And as I said in the beginning, we see minor, constant improvement, but minor. And the other thing that we see is, for me, very important, is reducing violence in school, and a little bit again, not massive, but reducing, and growing intimacy between children and teachers. Because one of the things that we notified when we worked on the reform was that many children said they have never spoken with their children intimately all through the year. And now all children have to do it. I mean, all teachers have to do it. So that was my choice, and there was 100 other things you could do, but that's what we did.
Just a short counter question, sorry. That all sounds great. Perhaps I didn't explain myself well enough. So you did all that for what? What would you think the purpose of that improvement is?
Improving learning skill. I think that what we did is improve learning skill, which I don't know how it translates to the test, but I think here is my analysis. Maybe I'm wrong about it, but my assumption is that a large chunk of children are performing less well than they could because little sort of disruption during their school time. So children that, they didn't listen and they didn't come to school one day, they jumped a class, somebody, I don't know, pulled their pullover and they sort of lost concentration. You usually don't find those things until, the test at the end of the year or at some later point where they are already falling behind. The small group teaching allowed teachers, and actually we introduced some other means, to allow teachers to really follow up what happens. And this is a minor help, right? Israel has a very good system of special ed, so children with real problems will be channeled to special ed, or special ed teachers will be added to their classes. But this is for children who just didn't understand this class. And you don't want to meet them after 6 years, you want to meet them after 2 weeks, where they have a form where I'm not too shy to say, I just didn't get it, or I don't know, this and that was interrupting me, or something like that. So it's not a procedural thing that you know exactly. And one of the things, one of the biggest fight I had was telling people there is no structure to it. The head teacher and the teachers should decide how to use it. Because it's not universal in any way that all classes, and I had this very fun exchange with the straight controller who, said this is a huge reform, lots of money, so we have to do a report. I said, okay, I can do a report. He did a report, everything was fine. But then he wrote me this letter and he called me for a consultation. And he said, look, perfect, everything is really great. But one thing, you didn't delegate clear enough instruction to the teachers and the head teachers how to use the tutorials. I said, I didn't want to. I don't think it's right. And he said, no. My controllers are saying that they use it in different ways, so it's not comparable, and no governmental system funding it with so much money. We have to know what's the outcome. I said, no, you don't understand education. If I will instruct what to do with ours, that's it. It's like the exams. I'll tell them you all should do this and this and this, and that's the end of this whole process. Was to create these little moments of intimacy where teachers decide what to do, and they can decide which children to pick up, and sometimes they'll pick up the chain children, and sometimes this is why I trust them. They are my teachers. And he wrote at the end of the report this very funny sentence saying, well, everything went very well, except for the unwillingness of the minister to create clear instruction for usage of money, and therefore, I don't know, in the next 3 years you have to check it again to see how it is used. So it's just to demonstrate how hard it is for an administration to say, oh, this is a free time for you to think. It's just a nightmare for administrations to do that.
I guess I want to pick up on that a bit. Assessment can be stifling, right, which you clearly described, and which I think many of us in this room have experienced as teachers or as students or both. And at the same time, it is a tool for democracy, right? Without a capacity to compare, to both assess the absolute attainment of, say, one's own child or one's own community, and also to compare across children or across communities. Parents, communities, states have no capacity, in fact, to discover that, say, they are being misserved, right? My child is actually learning much less than the child across the city, across the country, across the world, and that's wrong. And so you've given, this is something I struggle with a lot. I mean, I don't have an answer for how to do this, but I think it's this tension between the democratic tool that, say, assessment and accountability offers, but also the ways in which it quashes truly democratic education, right? That is this really, is one central paradox that you're pointing to.
Absolutely, and I think the two hints of what to do. One is less publication. Proficiency tests were working when they were not published every day. And
But
I
if they're
think,
not published, then the parents don't know, right? I mean, people who are trying to advocate on behalf of their own children or their own communities don't have the tools to do that advocacy work.
right. In many ways, I prefer the situation that they don't know on the situation that they know, because as far as I can see, and it's a problem, I agree with you, I would, what happened to these old reports? You can say this school is, doing, rather than ranking, just reporting. There's a difference between ranking and reporting that I think we should revive. But, ranking, this school ranking immediately intensified labeling, gaps, and who told me that? Jane Mansbridge, I think, told me that she lives in a neighborhood where the school is very good, and every time after they show the results, immediately somebody knocks on the door and says, can we buy the house? So it becomes this complicated game of money and property. And so somewhere between reporting and ranking, that's what we're looking for. Not that I have an answer, but I would want the ministry to know. I know that the ministry was a very important tool for me to decide where to invest and how to work. I'm not sure everything, and that's, again, a question about transparency. The idea is that everything the ministers know, the public should know. I'm not sure that it's working, and for the same reason that we wanted to work, more democracy, more closing the gap. Actually, I think it's a new sort of balance that should be found there.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what you were talking about and the numbers and the fact that so much of educational attainment really relates to factors outside the schools. The schools are a place that we're focusing on, and the way in which you feel that this is a way it's a conservative scheme to keep things in place. So the tests are like a tool to actually prevent bigger social change and to look at the places where social change needs to take place in order to change the outcomes for education. And I'm just wondering, I mean, the one thing that didn't come up in your talk, but there's a big talking point, is inequality, which in the U.S. has been going the wrong way. And inequality between and the same thing, I think, is reflected in the schools rather than the schools actually being the cause. I mean, but it is a kind of chicken and egg thing. And I just wonder, in terms of targeting your own research and the efforts that you're making, whether there's any potential mileage in actually shifting the focus to the bigger picture.
Well, certainly I think we should shift the focus to the bigger picture, and there is an issue I didn't discuss because it's not such a problem in Israel. I think it's a greater problem here. It's about funding, how schools are funded. We have a national funding of schools, and although private funding is growing, still the state funds 96%. So there are variations, but are relatively small. The locality and the geographic segregation and the neighborhood thing, and something that is very traditional in America, is actually intensifying this inequality to an extent that I can't even imagine a solution to this as long as it is going on. Israel is a small state that could be more controlled by, again, my fight for public education was grounded in that there are some things only states can do, and partly inequality and changing this rhythm of schooling, segregation, funding, and so on could be balanced only by the state. So the larger picture is important for state policies if you want to make a difference. And in England, it's somewhere in between. So England is in between Israel and the United States in the sense of funding. And I think that, again, you have the same problem of growing inequalities, which is, I think, the illness of the West. And by the way, you can look at the chart. This is the first chart that I had, I can find it. The chart, one of the first charts that I showed of the comparative. Oh, that's great. This one. It's interesting to analyze these countries according to inequality and ask yourself, for me, the most interesting group is actually Finland and Estonia. I don't know how many of you know anything about Estonia. Probably few. Estonia is a very small Baltic country. And you ask yourself, why is the Estonians so good on this? Right? It's a small economy with not a very large GDP. And it's not that I have an answer, but my hunch is, that goes back to your question, they're actually Finns. The Estonians and the Finns were once one culture, separated by history. Lots of Finns lived in Estonia. Lots of Estonians fled to Finland during the Soviet years and came back. And there are two very similar cultures with a high level of trust, high level of decentralization, pedagogic, not funding, but from a pedagogical point of view. And you ask yourself, how does it really play out? Whether more egalitarian countries, the democratic egalitarian countries are better introducing better education or not. I don't know if there is a clear pattern to that, but certainly we should think about it. And all these countries like Finland and Denmark and Sweden are now facing huge problems with immigration. And in 10 or 15 years they may not be where they are, and they may be multicultural states with the same problems like France, Germany, and the United States and Israel. So it's not only about inequality, it's about the type of inequality and the nature of the society, and social and ethnic gaps and religious beliefs and cultural traditions. And I just gave a paper somewhere on testing, and it was very interesting. The only guy who came up and said, well, testing is not bad, it's a bit intimidating, but it's good, was a Korean guy. I said, I'm sure it's a cultural thing that people see this as totally normal to intimidate children by testing, whereas others would say, well, let them be children for a while and not be that intimidated. So the cultural thing is interesting here. That I don't know. One thing I can tell you, I've tried to run about 6 or 7 different correlations, and nothing could predict the results. So it's much more complicated than that. Yeah.
I'm curious, and you said before about all the things that factor into the outcome, so it may not be the case you can get credit, but I'm curious, Israel is the envy of a lot of countries for the tech startups and the entrepreneurship. And you mentioned culture, and I'm just curious if you think that the Israeli educational system deserves some credit for that, or whether you think it's cultural or immigration patterns, or what explains why it is so low in that particular outcome?
It's a good question. Every time people say to me, the results are very low, I say, well, we have 3 of the top university in the first 100. We are a small country after all. Nobel prizes, innovation, technology, students getting and where the school system is ranked, it's very low. When you see the outcomes, they're relatively or very high. They're also high in terms of culture and creativity. And God knows, when I was in Singapore, they were actually going to send a mission to Israel to learn about creativity. And they said, and the minister said to me, "Can you explain to me this part?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe it has to do with the way Israelis drive." No order in the system. And that's actually, I think, a good thing. One of the things that I think is bad for Israel is routinizing. Israelis don't work according to routines. And if you try to make them a successful career, they will be terrible. And that's what we're trying to do now. And in many ways, I think it's culture, it's tradition, it's immigration, it's diversity. It's the army. It's a lot of things I don't like about Israel that actually create this motivation and integration. And, who can understand culture? I'm not a cultural scholar, but I know Israel produces low-level education and very high-level creativity. And that's obviously one of the reasons I started to look at it, because I looked at the number and said, well, what are they predicting? And I couldn't figure out.
So I thought this was fascinating. Thank you so much. And I wonder sort of what, John, do you think of all this? I wonder if you sort of rolling is great. Or, what do you think? I think a lot of this speaks to American social science systems that are now so prevalent in how we sort of define education. But I guess my question is, you mentioned Obama. You seem hesitant to talk too much, but we are in election season, and so I don't want to be American-centric, but where do you see the Obama administration fitting in? I thought it's sort of intriguing because we think of Obama as not conservative, but I'm hearing a little bit of a suggestion that maybe you think the administration is quite conservative.
Well, it's really not my role to judge Obama. I like him for foreign policy reasons. This is my great interest in Obama being re-elected. But I think he has a relatively conservative view of education, and so does Arne Duncan. I think that the race to the end. What is interesting is that I think if you ask them if they have a conservative view of education, they'll say they have a progressive view of education. And it's this mixture in language that I worry about. Because I think they're extremely intelligent guys, and they believe that you have to see results and it works. Partly he is exposed like every other politician, people are measuring him every 2 months what's happening. So it's part of it, but it's also a misconception that I think goes very deep into the minds of a lot of intelligent people who believe that that's the right thing to do. So that's where the real fight is to convince Arne Duncan that the race to the top, and maybe not the race to the top is so bad, because the race to the top also encourages a lot of creativity in schools. I mean, they can do programs and things, which I think is great. But, be less obsessive about exams and, read Diane Ravitch and understand that it's not a matter of Democrats or Republicans, it's a matter of thinking about creativity and what is good about America, which I think is very similar to what's good about Israel, in different ways. But the panic of the results is unbelievable.
I just wanted to ask you a sort of follow-up to that. As somebody who is a seasoned politician, how much of...
That's how I speak.
So how much of I always ask this question to myself, how much of their education policy and various other policies and actions and inactions is really a reflection of what you think Obama might really think versus who he's pandering to or what he has to do because he's in that role?
Well, I think it's both. I think he knew Arne Duncan beforehand. He was impressed by the Chicago move, and I'm not sure he's holding up like all these moves. They're going back and forth. That's the real lesson that we learn. It depends when you measure. Is it working? Depends when. Which is a sort of silly answer, but it's a true one. The problem about policy in education is that everybody thinks they understand education. So I think I told you that when we were doing breakfast. The problem about education is that really people don't convene enough to discuss this professionally. And there is this feeling, I don't want to be tough on Obama because I really want him to be elected. And I'm sure you'll all
I don't think you need to worry in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Even if there are Romney supporters in the room, they don't have any hope of.
Okay. So now that we've settled that, I should
Not in the state.
I think that, when he nominated Arne Duncan, there was a moment that was very illuminating to me, that he gave this speech and he said, I don't remember exactly his words, but he said something like, all we know is that this is very important. As I learned from Jill and Maya, Jill is Biden's wife and Maya's sister, education is very important. And I said, the F word, and I said, no, these guys get their notions of education from their siblings, and that's not right. I mean, something more, every time somebody in the government used to say something about education, he would say, my wife is a teacher. I was like, jump. And I said, so, And, you know, it's this assumption that everybody knows what's good for education, and it's actually not allowing us to discuss, you know, how